This week on Quality Digest Live, we find out what you can learn from startups.
That's right, we will. Plus, achieving the beginner's mind. That and more when we come back.
No.
That's my line,
really.
Dirk. Sure, I'll just say welcome back, everybody.
We don't need to anymore. Yeah.
Welcome back, Dirk, to reality. Welcome back to Quality Digest Live for August 19th, 2016. QDL, of course, your weekly look at who and what is making the news in the world of quality. I'm Mike Richmond, publisher of Quality Digest. Now, Dirk.
Oh, okay. And I'm Quality Digest editor-in-chief, Dirk Ducharme. You know, one thing we don't think about as a workplace demographics change is how, let's say, the gear and the clothing and the tools and so forth might have to change along with that demographic. And nowhere is this more apparent than with women beginning to work in jobs that have traditionally been male jobs. And an example of this is, let's say, women serving near the front lines in the armed services, or who work as guards in prisons, corrections officers, or police officers. All of these people wear body armor, and traditionally this body armor has been designed for men. Corrections officers, for instance, wear stab-resistant Kevlar vests, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Stab-resistant vests are basically the same as bulletproof vests. They're both made of Kevlar, but the weave is a little bit different, believe it or not. Actually, a tighter weave for knives than what you need for a bullet. This is a workplace demographic that has really changed, by the way. Women corrections officers now represent about 37% of adult correction personnel and about 51% of juvenile correction personnel. So a huge growth, particularly in corrections. Now, as we all know, women are, shaped different than us guys. They're kind of more curvy up there and down there, less planar, as the folks at NIST like to say, less planar. Guys are kind of shaped like this, women, not so much. So a standard vest, or a body armor that would work on a guy is not going to fit all that well on a woman. Now, more and more body armor manufacturers are designing armor for women because of this changing demographic. And by the way, this isn't a matter of looks. It's not like women want to look great in their body armor, because frankly, nobody looks great in body armor. I don't care whether you're Matt Damon or Angelina Jolie. If you're wearing your body armor and stuff, you basically just look like a slab of body armor.
Body armor, right.
It's really a matter more of comfort and, above all, safety. A snug-fitting, body-hugging vest isn't just more comfortable, it actually works better if it's flush to your body. So a woman wearing a guy's body armor is not giving her the best protection. This is kind of a Shaggy Dog story, and I'm getting to it. Okay, now everybody, including body armor manufacturers, need to test their designs. And those test standards come typically from NIST. And the problem is, until recently, NIST materials testing procedures for stab-resistant armor, for instance, were geared toward male armor. So basically they had a test procedure that was, you lay out the piece of armor, which tended to be planar, flat. You laid it over your test material, some sort of foam or something like that, and then they would do their stab-resistant tests. So those were geared towards males, and NIST had no, let's say, test dummies or surrogates to test non-planar or structured armor, which is what they call women's armor. The shape of it's not planar, it's structured. Meaning that the industry, the body armor industry, had no standard in which to test the efficacy of their armor on a female form. And this is important because I said in order for body armor to work properly and be tested properly, it needs to lay flush against the body, no gaps. And you need to test it that way. So the issue was that if you take female body armor with all its curves and bumps and all that, and you lay it on top of a test bed and then try to test it, you aren't really testing it because there's gaps in it, and so it doesn't really represent the way it's really going to be used. So NIST needed to create a woman bust form and develop a testing standard that could be used by industry. And believe it or not, it wasn't as easy as you might think, and you can read the article to get more information about it. it's not just about the shape, but also the type of material to make a bust out of. And that was a lot of the research that NIST was doing, is how do you come up with a standard form or a couple of standard forms? What's the shape? What's going to be the material? If you want to test a surrogate that represents the human shape and density as much as possible, you need to get all that nailed down in order to put it into a standard. But NIST did it, and this resulted in the standard, quote, specifying and testing idealized bust surrogates for testing of female stab-resistant body armor. That's what it's called, which pretty much says it all.
I don't know what else you could say. So,
But here's the follow-up to that. One of the things that NIST learned after creating and testing the surrogate is that stab testings of these surrogates showed that the impact location on a structured armor and the type of backing material increased the maximum deceleration of a spike impact. So in other words, the standard would enable designers to determine the best materials and location of those materials to give women in dangerous jobs the same protection as their male counterparts. So I found this article interesting just because you have this change in demographic. You have women out there on the front lines of whether it's the service or police officers or corrections officers. They're trying to use male body armor. Well, that doesn't fit right. So the manufacturers come out, okay, well, we'll make it shape fitting. Well, that's great. There's no way to test it. How do we know it's working? How do we know it works well? I mean, and it turns out, I think the implications here is what they're saying is that it's not about just taking male body armor and reshaping it. Mm-hmm. It really means that for women in certain areas, the material may have to, I'm assuming, maybe need to be beefed up in more areas, or maybe it doesn't need to be beefed up. Yeah. Maybe it needs to be supported differently. And once you have a body structure, a surrogate that you can test it on, now the manufacturers know whether the body armor for women works just as well as the body armor for men, which is kind of important to know, particularly if you're a woman.
I was going to say, especially if you're a woman in this space. And it's interesting. A lot of the surfaces you're talking about, the measurement of these surfaces, these planar surfaces versus these curved surfaces, freeform design, things like that. I mean, it's interesting because it is a very discrete measurement and testing type. I mean, you really can't have a planar, as you mentioned in the article, you can't have a planar surface and assume that you're going to be able to test it in the same way, because it's not going to work. And you're leaving these women with less protection than they need. So it's definitely a key story. And that was Going Against the Curve. Is that the name of the story?
Yes, that was. It was called Going Against the Curve.
Going Against the Curve, and that's
first link underneath your plate.
There it is. Staying ahead of the curve.
Going Against the Curve.
I was thinking
one of those curves.
I was like, did you mention that? Yeah, Staying Ahead of the Curves. That ran. I think that ran on Tuesday. Today's issue of Quality Digest Daily. All right, thanks, Dirk. All right, well, the next article we're going to talk about, this one is called What You Can Learn from Startups, and it's the title of an article right there that we ran in Quality Digest Daily on Wednesday, and as you can see, it was authored by a gentleman by the name of Peter Sherman, and Peter Sherman, interesting guy. He owns his own consultancy company right now, but previously in his career, he worked for several large and medium-sized organizations within industry, and he had some experiences there that were very interesting and touched on what he's talking about now. Now he's an entrepreneur, as I said, with a small company, but where he came from is really interesting. And it's really this I guess you can consider like a double perspective of the kind of the organizational man and the small business entrepreneur. That double perspective really gives Sherman an interesting take on this topic he's talking about. And the argument essentially that he's making here, it boils down to the fact that stability and standardization are really two things that allow large enterprises or medium enterprises to operate efficiently. But those things are exactly the kinds of actions that inhibit innovation. Small startups, on the other hand, have the freedom to experiment, and they can fail, they can learn, they can grow, all those great things that small companies can do so easily. In many cases, variability, which is the enemy to larger companies, is really kind of the end goal to smaller ones. You know, when you have an established process and you know what you're doing and you have a business model that works, you want to get rid of variation. You want to do what you're doing the same way every time and just pound it out and serve the audience that way. But
when there's a lot of variability, though, you might see some stuff that you
is really interesting. You might have the opportunity to innovate and build on that. Now, this is an interesting part of this I thought was really interesting. Mind you, Sherman is a master black belt. So when he says that variation can be a good thing, you know that was really some hard-won wisdom right there, right? I mean, for a Six Sigma black belt to say, yeah, we need more variation in the process, that is, to me, is pretty interesting part of the story. And the proof's in the pudding. He offers in the piece several examples of how startup thinking can benefit organizations. He's talked about healthcare and a few other environments where, you know, that startup idea, the innovative idea, that culture of learning is really very beneficial to small organizations, necessary to small organizations, and really useful for big ones too. And it's really, again, all about being willing to learn. He posits that the best approach is likely to be a mix of an efficient structure and something of a freewheeling devotion to ideation as well. And it's management's decision as to when to emphasize one approach versus the other, and where the company's culture falls in terms of exploring kind of the risks and the benefits of opportunities at either end of the spectrum. It's that term culture we always talk about and come back to. It's like, what kind of company do you have? What kind of company do you want to have? I mean, if you're a startup, it's a little easier because you're building the culture from the get-go, and you can say, well, we're going to have an innovative culture, we're going to have a startup culture, we're going to experiment, explore, and learn stuff and have a good time. It's harder, quite frankly, if you're an established company and you're doing business in a certain way that's successful. Obviously, if you're established, you've been successful. You've established processes that work for you and your customers. So backing that out and saying, well, we're going to try to now have a startup aspect to this can be challenging, it can be risky, and a lot of times managers are going to say, we don't want to do that, or we want to do that in a very controlled way, which maybe isn't a way at all. The best way to achieve a startup mindset, he says, and I think I agree with him, is he says you got to think like an 8-year-old. Don't be afraid to say that you don't know how to do something. Ask questions and experiment and explore. And you know, if you think about it, this is really incredibly liberating. It's a very efficient, effective way of incorporating new ideas into your organization. And the idea, this to me was really an interesting one, because I find myself struggling with this all the time, is this idea that you want to be able to admit you think I'd be great at this. You think you want to be able to admit your lack of knowledge of something, right? But it's hard. I mean, you know, there's a lot of pride when you're a professional, you've been doing something for a while. It's very hard to say, there's something here I think is important. I don't know how to do it. I'm going to go to it. Most people run away from that. They say, let me stick with what I know. It's a lot more comfortable there. But you don't get the benefits of that startup experience, the 8-year-old mind that you want to have, that you want to bring to something. You don't get if you're afraid to ask questions and say, hey, I don't know, can you help me?
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I mean, for kid, it's all about discovery,
right?
And just playing around and doing things different ways, and then all of a sudden they find something that's really cool, and then they build on that, and that's basically what startups do. Is a lot of times they go into it with an idea and they start building on it, and like you said, there's a lot of variation, and then somebody will accidentally do something. And they go, whoa,
that was cool.
Wow, that was cool.
Yeah.
You know, or here's an idea, or somebody, or very often there's just a free flow of ideas because nobody really knows what they're doing.
Yeah.
And people are just throwing stuff out there and seeing if it sticks. And you know, 90% of the ideas don't stick, but 10% of them are like, whoa, those are pretty good ideas.
But if you're an expert and you say, I'm an expert, I know what I'm doing.
No, you can't do that.
You're gonna shut down those ideas. So that's what he's saying you don't want to do. You want to try to look at your organization, if you are in a bigger organization, and incorporate some of those startup energies and try to take that.
Well, it's interesting because that article actually really dovetails really well in with mine. There was an article this week from Kevin Meyer called "Back to the Beginning with Ono, Suzuki, and Yoda." Talk funny, 5 biases that prevent rational decisions. And in the article, Meyer discusses what keeps us from making rational decisions. And he starts out with these 3 quotes, and these are what I think really tie into what you were just saying. The first one is from Taiichi Ono, who said, "Observe without preconceptions and with a blank mind." The second came from Zen master Shunryu Suzuki. "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few," which is just exactly what you were talking about.
Exactly right.
All right. And then finally was from the famous Yoda, who said, "You must unlearn what you have learned."
That's not how he said it. Come on, Derek. Say it the way he said it.
Unlearn what you have learned.
Good. Kind of.
Kind of. Okay, so we're talking about the beginner's mind, and really this does tie in with exactly what you're saying.
Exactly,
the beginner's mind really is like the startup,
or an 8-year-old,
or an 8-year-old is you don't know, and you just start thinking and doing stuff, and you don't have any biases because you haven't been with the idea long enough, or with the company long enough, or with the process long enough to have formed your own bias about what is right and what is wrong.
And the thing is, you're not afraid of that. You're not afraid of what you don't know. If you're afraid of what you don't know, you're going to run away from it. But if you say, well, I don't know that, let me go explore that, that's a much better approach to learning something and getting something out of it.
And we're talking about bias here. Meyer points out that there's, particularly as you get older and further into your business and been at it longer, there are several forms of bias which can keep you from being an innovator or even thinking rationally. And by the way, as with most bias, we aren't necessarily aware that we're doing these things. So that's kind of what makes bias so insidious. So let's take a quick look at the 5 biases. And by the way, you can think of these biases in terms of, is that going on this election year? Confirmation bias. We believe what we want to believe. We only listen to those sources that we agree with, and we don't consider opposing views. This is something it kind of sometimes comes down to cognitive dissonance. We want to read and be supported and watch the news and read the white papers that support the way we feel and the way our worldview is, because if something opposes that, it's jarring, and we have to rethink what we're doing, and that makes us really uncomfortable because I don't think that's the way it is, and so you shut yourself off. And that's what confirmation bias is all about, is just supporting your own belief and not being open to others.
You see that in media a lot, with whether or not you listen to Fox News or NPR.
There you go.
You're going to listen to the one that confirms what you already think.
What you already believe,
generally.
Right.
Yeah.
Loss aversion. This is loss aversion bias. Myers points out that researchers such as psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky have found that we are twice as likely to try to avoid than go after a gain. Yeah. We want to try to avoid risk take all measures to avoid risk, and we're not willing to kind of go out on a limb if there's gain to be spotted there. So we're more risk averse than we are. And by the way, again, this election year, kind of, what are people doing? A lot of people are not voting for the candidate they want. They're voting for the candidate that they're most afraid of.
Right, exactly.
Right? It is kind of the same idea. This candidate is more risky than that candidate, so I'm going to vote for the other candidate. I'm avoiding risk, not voting for what I want.
Right.
It's kind of the same idea. Conformity bias, otherwise known as groupthink. Survivorship bias. According to Myers, this is where we focus on the tiny fraction of people who have been successful, ignoring all those numbers who have failed. And we seem not to understand that every path is unique, and that instead of trying to mimic what some other person or what some other company has done, we just follow what they're doing. They were successful. Microsoft was successful. Apple was successful. This CEO was successful. Therefore, I'm going to do what they did, and I'll be successful.
Yeah.
Well, their paths are different. Their situations are different. Their contexts are different. I mean, you can't. By the way, this is one of the complaints a lot of people have with benchmarking. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, benchmarking. It depends how you do it, but you can't necessarily transfer an idea from one person or one company to what you're doing.
And the classic example of that is the Toyota production system with lean here in the United States. Right. in the 80s, where people thought they could bring the whole thing over without understanding the culture.
Without understanding the culture.
Went underneath that, yeah.
Exactly. And finally, we have first impression bias. And this is the tendency to believe that the first thing we hear is the most correct. And by the way, this is why PR people, no matter who they work for, their story, they want to get their story out there first. The first to dazzle us with a bunch of BS definitely has the foot up on everybody who comes behind them.
That's true.
I heard it first from so-and-so, and I'm going to lock into that.
That's very true.
Now, the thing is, you have to get rid of these biases, and how do you do that? I mean, how do you kind of combat that so we can get back to a beginner's mind? And it's really pretty simple. You've got to observe what's around you, Taiichi Ohno. Practice that a lot and encourage people to practice that. You have to ask questions. Why do I believe this way? What is the support for my view, and are there dissenting views? And you've got to be able to kind of stand back from where you are, look at yourself and your views objectively, which is really hard to, I mean, this is not an easy thing to do, but that's really what you need to do to get back to a beginner's mind, is you need to kind of wipe yourself out and go back to the beginning and say, okay, I'm going to get rid of all my preconceptions. I'm going to forget about this. I'm going to start from scratch. And how to do that is really difficult. But I think, first of all, you have to recognize, am I carrying around any of these biases? And if I do, I need to somehow address those biases and get away from them.
Yeah, one of the things I love about Kevin Meyer is that he has an Eastern, what would be the term, motif, Eastern outlook on a lot of things, and of course that's very valuable looking at lean, for instance, which is something he specializes in a lot. But he really is kind of a Zen practitioner. He talks about Zen practice a lot, and this idea of cleaning your mind, examining your motivations, and thinking beyond the rote responses is what he's talking about. And we all have a lot of that conditioning, and it's hard. It can be hard to get rid of it, but I think it's good to keep bringing yourself back to it. Just keep bringing yourself back to it, and it's a practice where you eventually will hopefully get to beginner's mind.
All right.
Good stuff.
Good stuff from Kevin Myers.
Absolutely, always. Okay. Well, now it's going to be time for our Tech Corner, our last little segment of the show here. This is a good one Dirk has for you. Periodically, we take a closer look at new measurement equipment that, of course, makes your job easier, or faster, more accurate, whatever it may be. This week, we're going to look at a gap, flush, and radius measurement system from NextSense, an Austrian company. It's called the Calipri, I think that's what it is, and Dirk is going to show that to us right now. So, Dirk, take her away.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Yeah, as Mike said, this is the Calipri from NextSense, and it's for gap and flush and radius measurement, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. Typically, let's talk a little bit about how radius measurements or gap measurements are typically done, and then we'll get into the Calipri because I'm going to touch on this a little bit. Typically, when you do a gap and flush measurement, almost all of them out there today are laser line scanners, as is the Calipri, by the way. They're laser line scanners, and typically what you do is you put your sensor up to, this is my fake gap, you put your sensor up to your gap, and you press a button, you take your measurement, and you get your gap and your flush measurement. And these work very well. I mean, they've been around for a while. They do give relatively accurate readings, but many of them suffer from a couple problems. One is a repeatability between operator. If all the operators aren't trained on the equipment properly, you can have some inter-operator error or variation between operators on the measurements. Now, obviously this can be addressed with training, and anybody running precision equipment should be trained properly, but it is an issue that's out there. The other one is simply that they measure gap and flush, and that's it. But there is a lot of information in the profile of this gap that isn't being collected, which is really valuable, and that can tell you a lot about your manufacturing process. So that's where the Calipri comes in. The Calipri consists of two pieces. There's the sensor, the business end, which I'm holding here in my hand, and it's tethered to a ruggedized touchpad. And by the way, it's tethered right now. They are working on a wireless version of this as well to get rid of the tether. Now the Calipri works a little bit different. It's a 3-laser system, and the way it works is you hold it up to your gap and you rotate it about the gap, and that allows it to take measurements from all angles of that gap and create a profile which allows you to do not only gap and flush, but also the angle between the surfaces, and more important, I think, is the radius, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So let's show you how this system works. We're going to go to our screen grab here, and I'm going to load a test plan. And the test plan is simply the instructions for the operator on how they're going to measure, let's say we're going to measure a vehicle here. And I'm going to bring up my Passat. And so we're going to get a picture of my Passat here. And there's the left-hand side of my Passat, the driver's side. And I can flip it around. We can look at the right-hand side there. Now, I'm going to zoom into this a little bit so you can see a couple things. Yeah, we'll zoom in. Okay, so you'll notice the arrow right here. The arrow tells the operator what direction or what orientation to hold the sensor. The red tells the operator about where they're going to measure on the vehicle. And the measurement box up here actually has a couple functions. One is when you select it, that tells the software this is the point you're going to measure. And also once the measurement is done, this is where your measurement data is displayed, or part of how it's displayed. We'll get to that in a little bit. So I'm going to actually move down here And I'm going to do a couple measurements, and we're going to do one on the bench, and then I'll run a little video for you as well. But let's go to our gauge cam first, and I'll show you kind of what this looks like in action. All right, so we've got, let me get this oriented so you can see it properly. There we go. So you notice I got my little gap right here that I've created, and I'm going to press the start button on the Calipri. It goes into measurement mode. I rotate it one way, I rotate it the other way. As soon as it's done collecting all the data, it just stops taking data. It finishes and it comes up and it shows me my results. Now, let's go back to the screenshot here for a little bit. And we'll notice that it tells me, once that data is done, that 3 of the data points, or 3 of the pieces of data I collected were good. Those are in green. I'm sorry, 2 of them were good, and 3 of the pieces of data I collected were bad. So there's a visual indication for the operator. And if we look at the profile, we'll see the blue is the actual profile of the gap that I shot, and these values in red are the data that we collected. We'll come back to that in just a little bit. Let me show you what this looks like on a real vehicle. I'll get a little piece of video we'll run, if we can run that. Okay, so I'm going to be measuring, this is a picture of me, video, me measuring my Passat. I'm measuring the front end of the door right now. So you can see I rock the sensor to the right, and then I bring it back around to the left, so it's collecting all the data related to that profile. And here's a close-up view of the same thing. By the way, you don't have to go from the right to the left. You can go from the left to the right. Basically, you're just working your way all the way around that scene. Now, I select the next point by using the touchpad, telling it where I'm going to measure next, and we go over and we measure this gap right here. So again, I move it to the right, and then I move it back around to the left. So again, I've captured that entire profile. And this is what it looks like on the screen as I'm capturing that data. There's a little visual guide that's showing the operator. So you see I've moved it to the right, it's collected the data in the center, and now it collects the data to the left, and then it displays the results, and there we go. So let's take a look at what kind of data we're going to get here. Now, what I did is once I was finished with that, I stored this data, the data measurement that I collected, I stored it onto the software so that I can come back and retrieve it later. So obviously you can do that. You can store all the data that you've collected and then retrieve it later, analyze it later. So we're going to do that. If we go to our screen capture here again, I'm going to upload my measurement data. And that's the measurement data for my Passat. There we go. And let's look at this. I can look at this in a split screen. So notice on the split screen, I can click on each of these points. And on the right-hand side, you'll see it's showing me the data for those points. Now let's just look just at the measurement profile by itself. And let's zoom in on this a little bit. Okay, so the data here at the bottom, that is the gap measurement. The flush is right here. This is showing me a flush of about 0.9 millimeters, and that is the difference between the height of this plane and the height of this plane. There's also the angle between these two planes, and more importantly, is it showing me these two radiuses. This radius on this fold, on this curve, is 2.82 millimeters, and the radius on the left-hand curve is 1.23 millimeters. Now, you might ask, why do we care about radius? Well, let me tell you. Here's an example. So suppose you're looking at gap, and the gap is off. Gap can be off for a couple reasons. It could be that the door, let's say, has been manufactured perfectly, but it simply hasn't been aligned in the frame properly. And so you could have a gap issue from there. And then that's simply an alignment issue. The other reason you could have a gap problem is because the door has not been manufactured properly. And if you were able to look at the radius, you might see that that radius is too big or the radius is too small. Over several measurements, you might find that the radius varies from door to door, that you have a lot of variation in the radius. radius. You might see the radius trending in a particular direction. Maybe the radius getting larger, maybe pointing to tool issues. So rather than an alignment issue, you've actually got a manufacturing process issue, and you don't necessarily pick that up from just looking at gap and flush. So being able to collect the entire profile gives the operator and engineers a little bit more information that they can use in order to understand their manufacturing process and if there's an issue going on with that. Okay, accuracy of the system. Basically 80 microns. It depends on the type, according to the manufacturer, according to NextSense, depends on the type of measurement you're taking. It can be better than 80, but their spec says about 80 microns. Repeatability is 35 microns. Calibration, this is always important. There is a calibration jig that comes with this. You mount this in the calibration jig and it does an automatic calibration for you. The jig itself can be sent back to NextSense and recalibrated and then sent back to you. So periodically, obviously, the jig is like your master. And so you can send your master or your calibration jig back and have that calibrated periodically. Finally, obviously, export. Everybody wants to get their data out and do something with it. You can export your data in a variety of different exportable database formats. You can export by individual part. You can export by operator. You can export by shift. However you want to do it, you select your fields, you export it. That data can be sent out, obviously, over the network, or it can be put on a USB stick and transported. This is just a simple touchpad, so it's a Windows, I believe this is Windows 8 on here. And that's basically it. I mean, so you have all that data at your fingertips that you can use. So once again, that is the Calipri gap, flush, and radius, or fold measurement, as they call it, radius or fold, from NextSense. If you want more information on it, you can go out to our player page. Right underneath, there is a link out to NextSense, to the Calipri page, and you can read more about it. Once again, thanks to the folks at NextSense for sending us the Calipri. And Mike, back to you.
Thank you, Dirk. Yes, there it is, the Calipri from NextSense, the gap, flush, and radius, or fold measurement system. Great tech corner there. Dirk, as always, good job. Thank you to the guys from
for sending that out. By the way, very easy to learn.
Yep.
Very easy tool to use.
Yep, absolutely. All right, well, that's our show for this week. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next week for a big week of Quality Digest Daily, and back here next Friday without me, but Dirk will be here.
I'll be here.
Look out for him
Yeah, I'll be here
next week on Quality Digest Live. So have a good weekend.
So long.
Bye.